Good morning. 160 years for First Congregational Church. As the choir will sing later in the service, my Lord, what a morning. What a morning, what a milestone, what a long history for this church. And Scooter and I are so happy to be here this morning to celebrate with you and see so many of our friends here today. I served 4 of those 160 years as your interim minister on 2 different occasions, but I was not here at the beginning. At 160 years, the church is more than twice as old as I am. I turned 70 last October, halfway to 140. And when I get to 140, I'm coming back here to celebrate with all of you on your 230th anniversary. How many of you will be here with me for that? There we go. There we go. And indeed, my Lord, what a morning that will be. But we were not here at the beginning, were we? help me, 57, 6? 1856. When you start a new enterprise, you start a new church, it always takes hard work, commitment, sacrifice, and the belief that God calls you to the journey, to the effort, and that God will support you along the way. That was the experience for the founding members of First Congregational Church in 1856, and it also was the experience for our ancestors in the faith. A reading from the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, beginning at verse 32. There are so many heroes and heroines of the faith: Gideon, Deborah, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, the prophets. Through acts of faith, they toppled kingdoms, made justice work, took the promises for themselves. They were protected from lions, fires, and sword thrusts, turned disadvantage to advantage, won battles, routed alien armies. Women received their loved ones back from the dead. There were those who, under torture, refused to give in and go free, preferring something better: resurrection. Others braved abuse and whips and, yes, chains and dungeons. We have stories of those who were stoned, sawed in two, murdered in cold blood. Stories of vagrants wandering the earth in animal skins, homeless, friendless, powerless. The world didn't deserve them, making their way as best they could on the cruel edges of the world. Not one of these people, even though their lives of faith were exemplary, got their hands on what was promised. God had a better plan for us, that their faith and our faith would come together to make one completed whole. Their lives of faith not complete apart from ours. Do you see what this means? All these pioneers, this great cloud of witnesses who blazed the way, all of these veterans cheering us on. It means we'd better get on with it, strip down, start running, and never quit. No extra spiritual fat, no parasitic sins. Keep your eyes on Jesus, who both began and finished this race we're in. Here ends the reading from the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, verses 32 through chapter 12, verse 1.
Good morning. Last fall, when I started to go through some of our historical documents as your church historian, I came to realize that this was a birthday year for us, an anniversary that ended in a 0. And oftentimes those are exciting birthdays, and sometimes they're dreadful birthdays, particularly as we personally round the next corner to the next decade in our lives. We usually celebrate in quarter centuries here, so 25, 50, 75, 100. But in light of all of the wonderful things that have happened here in the last couple of years, celebrating at 160 seemed to be a smart idea. So the people are called together to celebrate this event. Last fall, this day couldn't come soon enough. And as I got closer, I wished that I could slow down time because it was coming all too fast. And on Friday when I got a cold, I wished that instead of moving ahead 1 hour, we could move ahead 1 week because I have no voice. You may see me up here sucking cough drops and drinking tea, and I may have to excuse myself from time to time. Well, here we are today to reflect on what has been and what will be in our church. Each week as we gather here in the sanctuary, we hear stories from Scripture and other sacred texts, stories from which we can learn and grow. We hear the life stories and teachings of Jesus. He taught us through parables, using stories as a tool for how we should live our lives and how we should treat one another. He taught through examples so that we might learn from his ministry. These are stories of love, of acceptance, of compassion, of inclusion. They are focused and they are purposeful. Today, you will hear our historic stories. Some of them are first-hand stories and accounts of the life of this church thus far. These are stories of joys and concerns, stories of want and plenty, or strength and resilience, human stories that weave together the fabric of who we are today and who we might become in the decades which follow. There are lessons in these stories. Some of these stories told in the voices from the past, however, might seem eerily familiar to us today. As transcribed in a book that I found that I think was transcribed in 1870, from the document February 7th, 1856, a document that sits in our safe deposit box at the bank, and I quote, "A few brethren wishing to promote the cause of the Redeemer in their own hearts and in the world met at the house of Levi H. Bigelow and formed an organization for transacting business by appointing the Reverend S. Hemingway, moderator, and E. H. Crowell, secretary. The assistance of our Heavenly Father in our consultation was asked in prayer by the moderator, after which the following business was transacted. Resolved, that it is expedient to organize a Church of Christ in Lowell. Resolved, that we propose for the name of this organization the Congregational Church of Lowell. Resolved, that we constitute a committee of the whole on articles of faith and covenant. The following brothers and sisters, I might note, signified their consent and entered into covenant. Julius Babcock, Levi Bigelow, E. H. Crowell, Mary Jane Babcock, Lucy Bigelow, Mrs. T. H. Clark, and Harriet Shepard. And so it was in March of 1856, with resolutions adopted and articles of faith and covenant written, the Congregational Church of Lowell became a reality. The late Phil Johnson, Jan Johnson's late husband, wrote in 1981 upon the occasion of our 125th anniversary. His words really captured the spirit of our founding members and put into perspective our place in the broader history of this area and this community. And here's Phil's writing. When this valiant group first met, our nation was less than 80 years old. Their fathers may have fought on the Lexington Green or wintered at Valley Forge. The Indian Massacre at Frenchtown, south of Detroit, occurred only a few decades past. The state itself was only 20 years old. We were really a backwoods frontier town. The population of Grand Rapids was 2,700. Our founding year was also the founding year of the Republican Party. Abe Lincoln was still a young lawyer in Illinois. In going through more documents, I found this gem, that in 1906 our congregation celebrated a Jubilee anniversary, that of 50 years. A telling of those 50 years has been neatly typed and left for us these 110 years later. The unknown author of that writing tells of the efforts our founders gave in the construction of our first church building, and I quote, August 19, 1857. This young church decided to build a house of worship. A building committee was appointed. Does this sound familiar? And a subscription list circulated, which was headed by a donation from the Congregational Church Building Society of $275. Personal subscriptions in cash, labor, and building materials were secured to the amount of $822.50, making a grand total of $1,097.50 in their building fund. The list comprises nearly all of the community. The lot had been donated by Dr. Richards and Mr. Wickham, with the proviso that in case the building should be removed or used permanently for other than religious purposes, the lot should revert to the estate. When the frame was raised, an apparently insurmountable obstacle confronted them. The money gave out. The subscriptions of labor and materials were exhausted. The pastorate was changing again, with the Reverend Levi Wheelock succeeding Reverend Essler, and the skeleton of the church building stood unclothed. What should be done? Before the building had begun, Reverend D.L. Wheaton, then at Brighton, had been sent here to look the ground over, but almost upon his arrival, he was summoned home by sickness in his family. Superintendent, and I'm assuming that's the Sunday school superintendent, H.A. Reed, wrote an urgent letter to persuade Eaton to take up the work here again. Written in his humorous style, he painted a dark picture of the moral conditions of this place, told of murders and crime prevalent, and said that 6 or 7 citizens had been sent to the penitentiary. This fictitious letter, taken so seriously, so alarmed Eaton's wife that she utterly refused to trust her life and that of her family in such a dangerous spot. Well, after Eaton's wife passed, Reverend Eaton did return to Lowell to supervise the completion of the building, which stood at the corner of Spring and Howard, and was dedicated the 1st of June, 1861. During the congregation's first 50 years, life was fluid. Membership and attendance grew and it shrank. There were times of plenty and times of want. Members worked, volunteering of their time and efforts to conserve their funds. They worshiped twice on Sundays and met Thursday evenings for prayer. There were meetings and written rules and procedures. They adopted articles of faith. They built, repaired, incurred debt, and labored on. They looked out into the community and donated as they were able. Does this sound familiar to you? I think Phil Johnson captures the spirit of those early founders as he went on to write in 1981. I believe for the most part they were builders and believers. They believed not only in their God, but in themselves, in tomorrow, and in us. If this were not so, we would not be here today. And so here we are today, another 35 years down the road from Phil's thoughtful reflection in 1981. Builders and believers. This is a common theme throughout our collective history. That unknown author in 1906 ends his or her report with the following. During this half-century of church life, there have been years of famine more than years of plenty. There have been hours of dark discouragement when it seemed that the doors of the dear old church must swing to for the very last time. When the need was so sore and the pocket so empty, without a pastor, without funds, almost without men in the church, the women came forward. They came to the front and labored in every way, from reading sermons on Sunday morning and leading prayer meetings to sweeping the floor and trimming the lamps, for it was before the days of electricity, all this to save the janitor's salary. The only other weapons we possessed were the coffee pots and ice cream freezers. Many and many a night on the homeward way after prayer service, where a few came together, have the stars looked down so through the branches of the old Congregational maple at the parting of the ways and upon a group of discouraged disciples. There were councils held of ways and means, plans devised, obstacles discussed, courage given, faith strengthened, until burdens became lighter. Earnest counsel, which only the stars and the leaves and the Father of us all heard. For in our darkest hour, the Lord indeed comforted his people. We have something to be jubilant over in the fact that our church has been kept alive. We can only rejoice in the fact that through all the adverse winds blowing about us, we have kept the faith once delivered to the saints. The flame kindled 50 years ago in that humble home has never gone out. At times it has been fanned by the Holy Spirit until its light and warmth has kindled souls into the newness of life and developed the sweetness of Christian character. Sometimes the cold winds of worldliness and discord have caused it to flicker and almost go out. But it has never died, and please God, it never will, but burn brighter and brighter as long as this dark world needs its light." End quote.
Gretchen has been gracious enough to let me say a few words every once in a while in commentary on different parts of our history as it is remembered. Now, it's really important to remember where we've been so that we can at least test where we're going. And when we keep records today, remember that we're doing that for people that aren't here today. So when they read what we write about, they'll see what we were concerned about. They'll see what they think about that and things like that, okay? So it's interesting to me that Gretchen searched every record we have of the life of this congregation for all the time between its founding and 1900 or so, okay? Now, most of us who went to school know some pretty big things happened in the United States during those years. Not one of them is ever mentioned. Slavery is never mentioned. The Civil War is never mentioned. President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation is not given one word. There is not one word from that glorious document called the Second Inaugural Address of President Lincoln. There's nothing said about the new century. The 20th century is going to happen. 1900's coming. Nothing is said about that. I served the church before I retired. I served a church in Hartford, Connecticut that's one of the oldest of all the churches, the United Churches of Christ in the nation. It honestly was founded in 1632. 1632, long before there was a nation, over in what's now Massachusetts, and then they walked over to what's now Connecticut, okay? Well, their longest tenured pastor was a pastor for 50 years there. 50 years, really. It's funny because they've kicked every other pastor out since then, after only about 5 or 6. But anyway, back to this pastor. He was the pastor during the whole time of the Civil War. And one day when we were having this big clean out of one of the church's buildings, we were up in the attic part. And some of the kids they were really going at this, and they pulled out this big old cardboard box. It had a top on it, so we opened it up. Here were 50 years worth of handwritten sermons from this man. Now, this was during an especially important period of time, and in Connecticut, it was the church at that time because it was in the capital and everything. So the Connecticut Historical Society took possession of those sermons, and a person there actually read every one of them. And she was good enough to come and tell me when she was finished that during the whole time of the American Civil War, only in one sermon was there even an allusion to it, and it had 2 words, the Troubles. Maybe, I thought, that might have been because that particular minister owned a slave. Just some thoughts.
As we close this chapter of our history and we move on to the next portion of our service, I would like to share with you that at an annual meeting, March 9th, 1870, this congregation voted and approved the following: that the congregation being requested to provide themselves with hymn books, and they shall participate in the singing. So, as you take up your hymnal, I invite you to check the inside cover, because it's quite possible that someone within our congregation from 20 years ago, when we got this new hymnal, it's still the new hymnal, provided this hymnal for your use today. And as otherwise resolved and not yet rescinded, you are to participate in singing.
Moving along, 1900 to 1946, the reading is from the book of Acts, chapter 2, verses 40 through 47. In this part of the book of Acts, Peter is preaching, and gaining converts coming into the church is being born. Peter understands very clearly that in order for the church to be viable, this growth in numbers has to be sustained and enlarged. So reading from the book of Acts, Peter went on in this vein for a long time, preaching, urging them over and over, get out while you can, get out of this sick and stupid culture. That day, about 3,000 took him at his word, were baptized, and were signed up. They committed themselves to the teaching of the apostles, the life together, the common meal, and the prayers. Everyone around was in awe. All those wonders and signs done through the apostles, and all the believers lived in a wonderful harmony, holding everything in common. They sold whatever they owned and pooled their resources so that each person's need was met. They followed a daily discipline of worship in the temple, followed by meals at home, every meal a celebration, exuberant and joyful as they praised God. People in general liked what they saw. Every day, their numbers grew as God added those who were saved. Here ends the reading from the book of Acts, chapter 2.
The following was written in 1956 by Thelma Han, and read by Wesley Roth. Is he relative? Well, there were Roths here before Bill and Dottie, I think. It was on May 11th, 1956, in celebration of the 100th anniversary of this church. Here are a few excerpts from that narrative. In 1903, the total enrollment of officers, teachers, and pupils in the Sunday school was 116, with an average attendance of 72. Reverend Morris organized a successful Lowell Boys Union class during his 7 years here. New pews were purchased and the walls were redecorated. February 4th, 1906, a special meeting was held to consider the possibility and propriety of moving the church edifice to Main Street, and it was defeated by only one vote. In September 1910, the question of moving the church came up again. Reverend Ogg took up his residence here in December 1907 and stayed for 6 years, during which time the membership increased to 156. The summer of '09, Reverend Ogg conducted 4 well-attended union services on Sunday evenings at Island Park. On August 19, 1910, the Cheerful Doers were organized. And just as an aside, this group was formed from Mrs. M. Perry's Sunday school class. They remained in existence for 87 years until October 14, 1997. The first Mother's Day service was preached by Reverend Ogg on May 19, 1912. All through the record book, one item keeps repeating itself. R.D. Stocking, re-elected organist for the ensuing years. For many years, he played for 2 services and was supposed to receive $1 a Sunday, but no one paid him. So at the annual meeting, he would graciously cancel the debt as his contribution and start over again. In fact, for 54 years, Stocking was the only one who could keep that old organ functioning properly. He was also called upon to pump and play at many and all wedding and funerals. In March 11, 1915, the trustees met and voted to build a parsonage. For 4 Sundays in November and December 1918, the church was closed because the influenza had reached epidemic proportions. From January 1920 until April 1924, Reverend Cochran was here. During his ministry, the parish house was built. That would be that 2-story addition to the back of the old church. The ground was broken by the men of the church August 22nd, 1921. The Ladies' Aid furnished the dinner at noon. 2 similar bees were held on the 15th and the 19th. Then the work was turned over to the contractor, Reverend Henry Bank, and was completed December 23rd. June 15, 1930 was King Sunday. A bronze tablet was dedicated to Mr. and Mrs. Francis King, Mr. and Mrs. Frank King, and Miss Florence King, with a fitting program. The King family had been strong and faithful supporters of the church for 67 years. At a meeting held April 28, 1937 in the parish house, it was voted that the interior of the church should be redecorated in a soft blue and silver. The pulpit platform carpeted anew and the outside of the church repainted. The men volunteered to serve a public supper to raise money for the enterprises. After a vacation of 9 weeks, services were resumed in the newly decorated sanctuary, September 12, 1937. This communion table right here was dedicated to the memory of Mrs. Irene Childs Lee in 1938, and you can see the bronze plaque on the side. The youth group called the Pilgrim Fellowship became very active under the leadership of Reverend and Mrs. Barksdale. In 1939, Mr. Roy Hill, in memory of his mother, made it possible for the church to acquire the Hammond electric organ. Reverend and Mrs. Norman Woon and son Delbert were given a reception upon their arrival in Lowell, and that happened to be on Pearl Harbor Sunday, December 7th, 1941. And so during the next years, the church saw many changes and received many splendid gifts, such as new carpeting, modern light fixtures, an altar, tall cross and candlesticks, a baptismal bowl, a clock, tile flooring in the basement, and new doors. The Women's Fellowship has provided choir robes, many new chairs and folding tables, new dishes, silver, stoves, and refrigerator for the parish house. 5 groups of ladies worked individually as well as together in projects such as the annual public supper, the Christmas bazaar, and the Easter breakfast. Now I'd like to introduce Bill Roth, who's coming forward to share some of his memories here at our church.
With that introduction, I see that I'm penciled in for the era 1900 to 1946. As old as I am, and I'm old, I can't comment on what life in this church was like in the 1920s. Sorry to disappoint. As I have commented in the past, I grew up in this church as a 4th-generation member of the church. My first memory would be from the late 1940s in a particular Sunday school in the parish hall. We didn't call it the lounge then. And that second floor was a much larger room than it became during the late 1990s when it was carved up. The little kids, I was a little kid, would have their classes arranged around the lounge floor with little screens that separated one class from another. I got lost. Someone found me, took me over to the proper little spot, and I sat in one of those little bits of wooden chairs and a little bit of a wooden table. Companion to that is a memory from that same era. There was a stage that butted up against the back wall of the lounge that was the back wall of the church choir loft. I didn't know this at the age of 4, but there was an opening between the two rooms, and magically one morning a stern-faced man appeared from behind a curtain telling us kids that we were way too noisy for the adult Sunday school class that was being held at the same time. Which reminds me that in those days, in the 1940s and 50s, Sunday school for all ages was held before church services at 11. But that meant that as a child, I got to sit through the entire church service, including Reverend Woon's 1.5 hour pastoral prayer. Well, it seemed that long. As I got older, most of my memories revolved around those junior high and senior high Pilgrim Fellowship youth groups. Coming from a rural farm family, it provided a social setting that I really needed at the time. One memory was of a church service conducted by the youth groups. I was an usher, and as such, a deacon of the church during rehearsal instructed us on the proper way to pass the collection plates down the aisle. Now, he said that there would be 2 ushers on a side, 2 plates on a side, and you would alternate the rows, and if you did it right and you started right, the last 2 rows of pews, the plates would come back to you, and no one would have to walk those plates back across the room to the middle. Nowadays, I watch as their collection plates sort of meander on their own through the congregation. It gets the job done. Nothing wrong with that, but I often wonder what that deacon would think. The other memory from that I'll share with you on that youth group is what Nancy Wood mentioned here a couple of weeks ago, and that was the Irish Stew Dinner. The annual Irish Stew Dinner was a youth event, and it's wonderful that we're going to reenact that this coming Thursday. What I remember about it was that we, children and youth, would sell tickets to the general public. We would peel potatoes, scrape carrots, hope that nobody got cut. Then we would serve the meal, and I believe it was a sit-down meal, not a buffet style. We kids served the whole thing. And you know what? I never knew that there was anybody that visited us from the county health department. My sister Nancy was married in that church on June 1, 1957. Her story is that I got in here a few weeks, but I think it was a few months ahead of that wedding, but after the invitations had been sent, the entire church ceiling collapsed onto the sanctuary floor. Literally, the walls spread apart and the sanctuary ceiling came down. I think we almost lost the entire building in that episode. But the walls got pulled back in place, the ceiling was repaired. We had a stressed out bride, let me tell you. But the wedding was held on time, minus 2 pews that were crushed beyond repair. And for all of you who remember the other church with the back rows with the chairs on each side, that's the reason there were chairs there. Pews were gone. With all of this history, it was some concern on my part when we began to discuss a new building and a new location in the 1990s. I knew parking was a real issue, and that the city had informed us that parking along Hudson was going to be eliminated, which happened. It would also be difficult to provide any parking on the current block. Therefore, one of the committees that suggested ways to stay suggested that, in a report, that we use the funeral home parking lot, at least on Sunday mornings, as an overflow. As I listened to that suggestion one morning, my mind raced back to a cold, dark December evening in 1981. This church had put on a very successful live nativity pageant the year before in Richards Park. We had a donkey, goats, I think a couple of sheep wandered in. We had wise men, shepherds, angels, Mary, Joseph, and the baby. But on that evening, Harold and Alma Collins, longtime members of this church, both in their 70s, parked their car in front of that same funeral home and attempted to walk across the street. Both were hit by a car and killed. I think our history needs to call up the Collinses when we remember all of the other good times that we had in here, because that certainly was a tragedy. I can still hear the sound of that collision up here. It'll never leave. At this point in listening to that presentation, although my heart wanted to stay where we were, my somewhat logical brain said we probably needed a new facility that would provide safe off-street parking for ourselves and our children. But it was more than just that. It was more than parking. That old church could never be made fully handicapped accessible. For that, we needed new construction. My mind was made up. We needed to move, and we did. As I look back on that decision of mine, and it was a tough one, I realized it was the proper decision then, it's the proper decision today. We did what we had to do. One final thought. As it turned out, the construction of this new facility with no barriers, no steps, is the only reason today that Dottie and I can attend my historic family church. How ironic is that? Thank you.
First person who figures out during the offering how to get this like a Frisbee, you win a prize today. That was great, Bill. I like that. But it gets there, you know. Yeah, it gets there. See them standing there? That's the choir. I'm going to go up and join them in a minute here, but they think they get out of this. After the collection is over, I'm going to place these here, and I invite you, as I invite everyone today, to be generous as an act of faith, because all this worship we're offering to God, and to remember about that Phoenix spirit we just sang about. You just never know when that Phoenix spirit is going to kind of invade something we do that we think is small and insignificant, or we thought that's the best we could do, and it was. But that Phoenix spirit goes through these offerings too. It takes the love we want to give. It takes the faith we want to represent. Far outside these walls of this church, or Lowell, or Michigan, United States, around the world, because there are persons just like us around the world trying to be Christs to others. So in that sense of that Phoenix spirit, in that sense of generosity, let's make our offerings of gifts and tithes today.
And before we begin, I would like to say a special thanks to my friends in Cantando, Wendy and Kathleen, and Libby and Stephanie. We have some people up here you might not recognize. Allie DeCenzo is older, so we're happy to have her with us today. And Allie brings with her Rob in the back row. And I've known Kathleen for a very long time because she actually was a parent in the school where I taught. And bringing with her today, she brought one of my former students, Mahesh, in the back row there. So we're very happy to see members past and present and visitors with us today. Oh, and Megan McNaughton.
Modern Times, 1946 to 2006. Now, excuse me. Did you put something in?
I looked inside that billfold. I saw more. Okay.
Modern times, 1946 to 2006. The church is an organization of individuals brought together who come together in common life with a shared identity as God's people. The church seeks to be faithful to that identity, responding to individuals in the church, while at the same time being concerned about the congregational life, the collective gathering of people together in terms of its present health and future viability. All the decisions that are made in the church then involve a process of discernment, discussion, dialogue, disagreement, conflict. Pastoral leaders and church members and their abilities to work through these issues gives to the church its health and vitality. When I was with you the first time, in the early 90s, there were a number of individuals who made very unique contributions to the life of the church. Many of them are no longer with us, but I remember them so clearly in my memory bank. Goldie and Royal Clark, Frank Carr, Leonard Jackson, Bev Spillane, the Reverend Irvin Hyde, Florence Holtz, and others. The issues that we dealt with in the early 90s were familiar issues. They were the use of resources, financial resources, in their abundance and in their scarcity. There were building needs that had to be tended to. I think, Bill, that I came after the roof caved in, so that wasn't one of them. But there were building needs, nonetheless, that had to be responded to. There was mission outreach and community involvement in the city of Lowell. And all of these discussions always carried with them divergence of views that had to be worked through. This is life in the church, and it has always been this way. In his letter to the Romans, the Apostle Paul includes these words to the church in Rome: if possible, live at peace with your brothers and your sisters. If possible. Because he understood that peace within the fellowship of the church is always an achievement and never guaranteed. Well, we live in a country that has a long history of seeking to live with this tension between the rights of the individual over against the collective welfare and well-being of the community. Robert Bella, in 1985, co-wrote a book called Habits of the Heart. And among other things, he dealt in this book with this tension between individualism and community. And I would read just a brief paragraph. In the 1930s, the French social philosopher Alexis de Tocqueville offered the most comprehensive and penetrating analysis of the relationship between character and society in America that has ever been written in his book, Democracy in America, based on acute observation and wide conversation with Americans. Tocqueville described the mores, which he on occasion called habits of the heart of the American people, and showed how they helped to form American character. He singled out family life, our religious traditions, and our participation in local politics as helping to create the kind of person who could sustain a connection to a wider political community and thus ultimately support the maintenance of free institutions. He also warned that some aspects of our character, what he was one of the first to call individualism, might eventually isolate Americans from one another and thereby undermine the conditions of freedom. The central problem, Bella writes, of our book concerns the American individualism that Tocqueville described with a mixture of admiration and anxiety. It seems to us that individualism and not equality, as Tocqueville thought, has marched inexorably through our history.
In 1956, the congregation celebrated its 100th anniversary with a tea and banquet held at the Masonic Lodge. As Bill has already mentioned, the sanctuary ceiling fell in, and it was in 1957, weeks before your sister's wedding. In 58, we welcomed Reverend David Debink as pastor. Members remember that during the 50s, the church was always open, and neighborhood kids would come here and play without adult supervision. In the 1960s, the women of this church started a rummage bin in the basement of Dr. Bob Reagan's dental office at the corner of Main and Riverside. He charged a rent of $1 a year. The money earned was applied to the mission of the church. Monthly potlucks were also held during the 60s as a way for the congregation to share in fellowship. In about 1962, Reverend Davis arrived. Children from the community would meet here for music and fellowship during his tenure. In 1969, the Reverend Irvin Hyde became pastor, retiring in 1973. For many years, our church and community churches hosted that live nativity at Richards Park. In 1974, Reverend Richard Greenwood became pastor, arriving at church that first day and many days thereafter on his motorcycle. The church first participated in the Fallsburg Festival with a food booth in the 70s, serving homemade pretzels. During Reverend Greenwood's tenure, the tradition of a spring-summer all-church picnic was established, using the Fallsburg Park Pavilion and grounds. In 1979, this will sound familiar, to save money, the heat was turned down. One brutally cold, a negative 24-degree day in January, the pipes in the basement froze and burst, creating a frozen waterfall over the piano. In the late 70s, local teachers were allowed to gather in the church, our congregation, to vote whether to go on strike. In 1984, the church tore down the houses west of the former church building and developed a parking lot. Street parking was all we had until that was completed. When Reverend Greenwood left in 1985, Reverend David Higgins became interim minister. About a year after his arrival, the congregation decided to call him as pastor. He was instrumental in getting and placing our first peace pole in the garden area south of the sanctuary in the old building. He was pastor when the narthex was remodeled and the elevator added. David was also instrumental in hiring our first part-time Christian education director, Mrs. Eleanor Martin. David was also supportive and helpful to the Ingram family during the adoption process and to other families during times of crisis. In August of 1989, Terry Tessari arrived as our interim minister. He served until December of 1991. Now, you got to know that Terry and Scooter lived in Portage and still live in Portage. And Terry, I did not write this. I'm lifting this from someone else's writing. He was often barely able to make worship on time. Just saying. Dr. Rod... Well, you take your pick. It's all good. Dr. Roger LeWare accepted a call as pastor in January of 1992. He quickly established himself in the community as an enthusiastic and passionate leader in efforts of mission, ecumenism, justice, and youth activities. Some of you will remember this. In 1993, the congregation decided to paint and refurbish the sanctuary. The color was silk ribbon. It was selected as a match to the glass in the stained glass windows, but as it appeared much pinker once painted, it drew much comment and became an item of great discussion at the congregational meeting. Pennies for Lowell, a home repair program, began at that time. The YMCA in this church came to agreement on a daycare center as a mission to the community. In '95, the youth ministry added Boundary Waters canoe trip to their summer schedule. In '97, the church offices were remodeled and expanded. The endowment board expanded the scholarship program to the church, to include college-bound youth and people from the greater Lowell community, as well as from within our church. Discussions began on the need to expand our facility. The council surveyed the boards and congregation via a task force to determine needs that would be served by future expansion. Church members helped with local Habitat for Humanity projects. In spring of 2000, Pastor Lowell was honored as Lowell's Person of the Year. We began reaching out to the Lakota Indians of the Agala Nation on Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. On December 3rd, a special congregational meeting was called to discuss purchasing 19.2 acres, this piece we sit on today, 1 mile north of our present location. In '01, with the leadership of our then Director of Music, Ms. Megan McNaughton, a praise band led us in special music praise services the third Sunday of each month throughout the year. In August, interviews by the building committee began, and the process of hiring an architect and building for the building for our new church facilities. And now I would like to introduce you to the 2000 Person of the Year, Dr. Roger Lowell. Sorry.
You know, when I thought about the time that I've had with you and the way you have empowered a ministry to which God has called me, I realized that there are far more than I could say than you'll ever want to hear. So I thought what I would do is just lift up a few things. I want to lift up the fact that in 1991, when I came to this town, and now that I have experienced this town and what it means to be a part of this community, I say to myself, what took me so long to get here? But I remember that it was people, and it has always been people, who have been the central foci of the life-changing events that have been a part of me and also a part of you. When I came, Jerry Abel was secretary. Had a little cubicle, actually like a closet without a door, that was right next to my office. And when she needed to retire because of health reasons, we had a couple other secretaries, and then finally we were able to have Jan Bueller be a part of the team. And what a great part of the team Jan had been for me. You know, these are people who were very supportive and very helpful. And then I remember also that before Shannon, we had Eleanor Martin, and I've always been able to have a team of leaders to do ministry. And it's sometimes that which is attributed to me really needs to be attributed to the team. And so I'm always thankful to the team. And I see a number of people here, Jan over here and Shannon back here, and it's so good to be a part of that. You know, I remember this church as the church with the basement that leaked. And early on, you all remember that, you know, where we could come down to 3 or 4 inches of water on the basement. And finally, we were able to take care of that after visiting a home show. We ran into a person who had the system that we installed in the back of the kitchen and with the sub pump, and that took care of the water on the basement floor that we would find and I think that would probably been happening for years. I remember also the late Paul Towsley, because Paul was not only a a tremendous leader in this church, a man of great faith, and one who was willing to dig in. And I remember that he and I started the demolition of the kitchen. Of course, what we ended up with was the kitchen designed by men, and it was always called that, and because apparently the design did not really fit with everybody else. But it was Paul that really helped to get jobs done around here, and we missed him tremendously when he died. I want you to remember the Easter sunrise services with me, because we tried in Michigan to do those outside a number of years, and some of those years were very successful, and then there were the other years, okay? And you'll also remember the Easter where it was just a nice morning when we started that, but when we came out of church, we were covered in snow, and all of us with our Easter gear without winter coats. You know, it was kind of a real shock for us. I want you to remember the Christian traditions, the Christmas traditions that we had. The many children's programs. In fact, it was at one of the children's programs that I learned something that I never learned in seminary. Did you realize that the shepherds checked the eyes of the sheep with the flashlights that they carried? I never knew that, you know. But we learned that in a children's pageant, didn't we? You know, and how neat that was, just to see the kids doing their things, being children. Because remember, it is about the children as well, as we can remember. And it was how fun it was to be a part of the candlelight. And somebody else had mentioned that. The candlelight service that we had, which was always ended with the lighting of candles. I still couldn't believe the fire marshal let us use real candles, but hey, and the singing of Silent Night. I remember also that we had a tradition of caroling, and we tried it. That tradition was strong sometimes and waned other times, depending on the volunteers that we got. But we were always able to go out with the young people, and one of the places we would go would be to the various nursing homes, and we would go up the hallways. And I don't know where this idea hatched, but we had an idea that on one of those that we would be giving gifts, and so our youth worked up gifts that, and some of it probably fruit and that kind of thing, that we would then go around and knock on the doors and give gifts and wish people a Merry Christmas. One of those occasions, and you know, what do you do when somebody answers the door naked and when you're going to be handing them gifts? So, well, the two junior high just stood there with their eyes wide open. I ended up taking the gift, looking the person in the eye, and handed it to him, and then we left real quickly. But, you know, those two young people who were involved in that, I'm sure, never forgot the caroling that they were a part of, wherever those young people are. You'll remember summer programs and how we were able to bring together youth here and at the other church, and we would camp in the side yard of the other church, and we'd get our children involved as well, and having some of our children's campouts. Those were always really interesting because you had your agenda and they had theirs, and it was kind of, hopefully at various times they would intersect with something that maybe it was a song, maybe it was a wisdom that a young person, a child would share. It was always a beautiful experience, but not with a lot of sleep. And I remember sometimes we would have to move it because in Michigan, July can be cold. So there's many times, I won't say many, but a number of times where we had to move them out of the tents and into the church and just be everywhere on the floor to try to get some sleep and to get some people warm from those campouts. I also want you to know the commitment that we have to Pine Ridge, to the Oglala Sioux, was a very, and still continues to be a very important commitment that we make to the poorest place in our nation, the poorest place in our nation, that we continue to serve that. And some of us will be going back there again even this year. And you remember that Shannon and I worked diligently and worked hard to write a program where we could invite children to get started in coming out to Pine Ridge so that they too would begin to sense the power of being in mission to those who are different than others without the judgment, so that they could begin to experience the life of another person, and not so much to compare it to theirs, but to see how that life enriches theirs and how they could be a part of something that is much greater than just their own personal growth. And I think we were able to do that for a number of years, and how wonderful those years were. And Shannon was just a hallmark in leadership in those for that program. I remember the special Wednesday evening programs. Those were important to me, and I think they were important to a number of other people when we sought to try to come together on a Wednesday night to worship and pray and to sing contemporary songs and try to build and add to our community a richness of faith. And I remember the building campaign and all the wonderful people that I had a chance to work with, and how I felt that truly the Spirit of the Lord has stirred our soul, and that we can never be again the same as we were before because of that. And how that, just the number of meetings, remember the number of small group meetings, the number of gatherings we had, and how good that was. We were all focusing on how could we move a church to be greater than what it is now, and how could we answer the call that God had given to us. And we're still doing that, because you realize that this church is still blazing the way in this community. This is the church that will be bringing the light of open and affirming to this community in a way that we've always wished it could happen. We talked and we talked and we talked, and how scary it was at first, and how uncertain we know this to be, because we know not where God is going to be leading us, even as we make the decision that we know to be the right decision. We know not how God is going to lead us, but we do know God is going to be leading us. The history of this church tells you that God is going to be leading us, and we're going to be leading us through the hills and the valleys. And there will be those who will leave, but there will be those who will join, because the vision is a vision of healing and strength and new life. A healing for families who have been injured by the church because their children were not acceptable. You think of that's tragic when you think of that. Well, you are stepping out. And you've done, I remember the groundbreaking service that we did somewhere in here. I remember how we have come together and watched the steeple to be placed. I remember standing next to the moderator who was shaking in his boots as we leaned over. I guess I leaned over too far to put that cross, which is about 5 foot tall, on the top of that steeple. And you remember that, some of you. In fact, Jan Johnson drew a wonderful picture that says the community gathered in a kind of a new direction. I remember this cross. I knew this cross when it was a tree in Ken and Gretchen's woods. I remember Ken and I loading that log on a trailer that was too small for the log, but that's all we had. I remember the tires being so flat. Remember this, Ken? We really wondered whether we are going to make it over there or not when we took the log over to the mill to have it sawn and for that walnut to be dried. And then I remember when it was finally made into this cross. And I remember us and a number of people right here in this sanctuary when we lifted that thing up there and we fastened it, and it leaned forward to greet all with a reminder that truly God loves you. God truly loves you. And I often think that as I knew this tree before it was a cross, so also God knew us before we were a community, and how rich it is to be a community and be reminders of God's great love. Well, these were some of the things I remember. I remember that it was because of the work of this congregation and the vision of this congregation that Flat River Outreach Ministries was created. Yeah, I had a part in that, but you know, there were like Lynn Beenan, who was very much a part of that we couldn't have done it without her. And there were others who were from this church who have early on volunteered and early on helped that thing to get off the ground, to be what it is today. A volunteer ministry, you know, that is probably the largest ecumenical piece of this community, and it started with your vision here. You started a program with pregnant teens so that they could get their education. Remember that? Yeah, that was a very important piece of the life of this church and changed the lives of those people. You remember that you as a congregation, even though you struggled, you reached out, and you're doing it today. Not only are you reaching out to all of those who could not be a part of a worshiping congregation, even though they had faith, they couldn't be a part because they were gay or lesbian. And you've reached out, and you are saying, we have a ministry. We have a God that loves you just like God that loves us. That's huge. And then the open table. What a great name for your feeding ministry that you're launching now. Open table. Why? Because the table of the Lord has always been open. Always been open to anyone who wishes to come and feed on the power of love. And actually, that's what you're going to be serving when you serve from the open table. Thank you very much.
I'll be short because I know that all of our stomachs are starting to growl a little bit. So let me just say that my wife and I do live in Portage, Michigan. That's about an hour and 20 minutes away, and I drove regularly the 2 times I was your interim pastor. First time I wasn't too smart, second time I got smarter, and I asked some members of the congregation if I could stay with them in their homes, sleep overnight. So Gloria Jackson, Gloria's here this morning. Gloria opened her home very graciously. I slept at Gloria's many a night. I stayed with the Dubbings, Don, I think, and Sheila Dubbing. I stayed with the Aineses a time or two, and the Milks. While I was here, I slept around with congregation members. I should say that. But it all worked out, and it saved that trip back and forth to Portage, particularly in the winter, which got harder and harder. Well, let's turn to New Beginnings 2006 going forward. New beginnings are right at the heart of Christian life and living, aren't they? New beginnings for us as individuals, for us as churches, and really for the whole cosmos, the universe, in an eternal and forever kind of way. The reading is from the book of Revelation, chapter 21, verses 1 through 5. I saw heaven and earth new created. Gone the first heaven, gone the first earth, gone the sea. I saw a holy Jerusalem, new created, descending, resplendent out of heaven, as ready for God as a bride for her husband. I heard a voice of thunder from the throne. Look, look, God has moved into the neighborhood, making God's home with men and women. They're God's people. God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death is gone for good, tears gone, crying gone, pain gone, all the first order of things gone. The enthroned continued, look, I'm making everything new, making everything new. Write it all down, each word dependable and accurate. This is the reading from the book of Revelation, chapter 21. Verses 1 through 5.
when I was growing up, I was singing hymns to a different hymnal. So the last hymn that we sang was a new one to me when we came to this church 20 years ago. And I always got a kick out of the phrase, grant us courage, grant us wisdom, grant us courage for the facing of this hour. And we rival Reverend Wound with the facing of this hour and a half this morning. So I as well will be brief. On October 5th, 2006, we held our first worship service in this building under the leadership of Roger Lowell. During the next 2 years, Roger instituted the Faith Alive service as a praise service during the midweek. And as it would be that in 2008, we said goodbye to Roger as he began his retirement, which isn't really a retirement for anybody who is retired. You're never really retired, so. We welcome back Terry Tassari, who also retired out of this church in 2010. So in the spring of 2010, we call Reverend Christopher Schwab here. He and his family came to us from Hawaii and settled into life in Chile, Michigan. It was during that time, during Pastor Chris's tenure here, that I think the seeds for our A2A were sown, and which became our open and affirming piece. They were sown during that time. In 2013, we engaged in the New Beginnings program, which Shannon is going to talk to you about in just a moment. It was also during that time we took a good, long, hard look at our finances as we were encroaching on a time of want. And it was at that time we had to make some staff reductions. Because of that, Pastor Chris was called to full-time ministry elsewhere. On Easter Sunday 2014, we welcomed, out of retirement, I might add, the Reverend Richard Sherlock as our newest interim pastor. With the direction emerging from New Beginnings, we began discussing what kind of mission we were called to undertake and how we could make a difference for people in our community. And as I close here, I would just bring us back to the words of Phil Johnson, builders and believers. And so here's to the next piece of our history. Shannon?
It occurred to me that Liam will be exactly my age when this church celebrates its 200th anniversary. So I'm old. And I hope to be there, but who knows? We'll see. New beginnings. We have a lot of them. We have so much to be proud of and so much to be thankful for. And one of those things is the tutoring that we're presently doing. That's an old thing that has been resurrected, and we are doing it again, and it's amazing, and it's touching kids and adults in so many important ways. Our Open Table program, which begins this week, Thursday, and will continue for many, many more Thursdays to come. We hope that everyone partakes of that meal of fellowship and community and food and just being neighborly with each other. And our Open and Affirming Covenant, which we have recently adopted. These are all amazing and wonderful new beginnings for us and are leading us forward. I want to share with you just a short little story that I read when I was preparing for today. It's about Italian violinist Niccolo Paganini. He's thought to have been history's greatest violinist. And one evening it said of him that in the early 1800s, Paganini was performing before a packed house. As he embarked on the final piece, one of the strings on his violin snapped. Undeterred, Paganini kept playing. A few minutes later, a second string snapped. And again, Paganini kept going. Now reduced to playing a classical masterpiece on just 2 strings, and then an unbelievable thing happened. The third string snapped. Yet Paganini kept going, finishing the piece on just 1 string. So brilliant was his performance that those in the crowd rose to their feet to give him a standing ovation. Now, Paganini may have been one of the people that Rob Siltman had in mind. Rob Siltman is of Apple. He's part of the Think Different campaign. And he said this: "Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify them, or vilify them. About the only thing you can't do is ignore them, because they change things. They push the human race forward, and while some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius, because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones that do. Now, sometimes over the last 160 years, we have been called crazy. We have definitely been called troublemakers. We see things from all sides because we come from all sides. We don't always agree. We sometimes make tough choices. We do things differently. We do some things people don't like. We might be seen as reckless or as hanging on by a string. But innovation is often mistaken as something else. Maybe we are different, but we can't be ignored. We embrace our crazy. We do seek to change the world. We have our new mission statement and our new belief statement on the cards in the pews. Our mission statement sees ourselves as progressive, not in the political sense, but by a willingness to question tradition and focus on promoting values such as compassion, justice, mercy, and tolerance. In 2006, we fully embraced our calling of our ministry, and we moved to this beautiful new building to allow ourselves the space to do God's work. In 2016, we proclaimed our open and affirming covenant, which enables us to be on a journey to accept all people as they are. Now we are embarking on our feeding ministry, Open Table, which will honor people as individuals and as a community with free meals, loving community, and service to each other. That's this week, folks, and every week thereafter. Maybe we are crazy in love with a God that is so moving in this world that we are powerless to stand by and do nothing. So crazy that we put our trust in God to keep our missions, to keep building our missions when the budget says maybe we shouldn't. So crazy that we still believe we can change something in this messed up world. And if these last 160 years have taught us anything, we are just crazy enough, rebellious enough, and determined enough to make it happen. Sorry. We are not hanging on by a string. We are Stradivarius being played by a master. Thank you.
That last church I told you I served in Hartford, Connecticut, around about 1960, should have shut its doors. There weren't really enough people left with what had happened in the United States with urban degradation and flight to the suburbs and everything, and it was right downtown. The reason it didn't shut its doors was because it had a $12 million endowment. That is the only reason it's still there today. Not because of its people, but because of its endowment. Now, its people are really neat, very diverse group of people and everything, but it couldn't have gotten through that hardship. So I only share that with you because you made it through without an endowment. As Roger said, he's always enjoyed having a team to work with in ministry. Most of you aren't paid, not that I am, but seriously, I mean it. You all need to understand how vital you are, even though you have no right to be. Not by any of the world standards, but you do. So I wanted to, I read all the time, and lately I've been reading some history books about the end of World War II from the view of the Japanese in one case, but then just of the end of the World War II for some of the aviators in Europe, the United States aviators. During the first parts of their time in the air over Europe, bombers, a lot of them got shot down, just a lot of them. And it was a really scary thing to know you had to go back up there. But as people back here built more and more fighter planes, they built better fighter planes, and they got more of them over there to go along with those bombers on their raids. The fighter planes got rid of a lot of the enemy fighter planes that were shooting them down, because that was the main thing they were afraid of. But as the war went on and the bombs took their toll on Germany and its process of making instruments of war, the fighter planes started disappearing. But you know what? There was never a time that those aviators who were going over there to bomb weren't a bit afraid. Because you know what else they had learned? How many of you know what anti-aircraft fire is? Do some of the young people you've read? It's called ACAC, or it's a little step up from firework. It goes up in the air and explodes, and it sends out pieces of metal, most of which aren't bigger than that. See that? Have you ever stood next to a bomber in a museum or something? Ever stood next to that? Ever stood next to a 500-pound bomb? See that? See that? Because every one of those airmen that went over there to bomb knew that that was all it finally took to take them out of the sky and get rid of them. I'm not suggesting we're at war, but I am saying that as we go forward in our new beginnings, the three ministers who were, not only gracious enough but lucky enough to be here with you today of this congregation, we were trained by some good seminaries to be as good as we could be in a way that worked for the churches for quite a long while. And we did the best we could in the ways we'd been trained. And the one thing I can guarantee you is those ways don't work anymore, and they aren't going to either. It's important for you to remember that you learned that on your own. That trying your best to keep the old things going, just doing better, it wasn't going to get you out of any problems, was it? It wasn't. That's why it was so, written on the walls, do new beginnings, huh? Do new beginnings. Einstein's famous thing about if you keep doing the same thing over and over again, just trying to do it better, and you think it's going to change, the only thing you've done is earned insanity. So I want you to understand about yourselves that you already know those things, that the old ways aren't going to work. The world has changed. It's so different. The people that we'll find ourselves serving here in Lowell, after we've been doing these new ministries of tutoring and of feeding, after we've been doing them for a while, I'm not saying the first week or even the first 6 months, after we get to know these people, we're going to find out some things we don't like to know about why they're so poor they can't buy that food, why they can't get a job. We're going to find out a lot of those things. And we're going to find out it's because who we in the United States have become as a society. And if we are serious about giving new lives to those people that we're serving, you know what we're going to have to take on, don't you? Society. That's that bomber up there, and basically it's going to feel to us like all we are is some anti-aircraft fire. What about the terrible division between rich and poor? which is merely an extension of the terrible continuation, even after a civil war, even after the Emancipation Proclamation, even after the Civil Rights Acts, of white privilege, of treating black people as second-class people just because of the color of their skin, no other reason, and of organizing our society around that. We're going to see those big things. I said at the beginning, there was nothing in those early years about the Civil War, about slavery, about anything like that. There was very little, if any, in all the rest of the minutes or the memories, the remembrances of this congregation about World War I, World War II, the Holocaust, about Jim Crow, which may have done more damage to persons of color in this country even than slavery. No mention of any of those things. Why, there was no mention that it took Dwight Eisenhower to integrate the Army, even though black persons lost their lives fighting for this country. No mention of things like, come on. What I'm trying to get at is we're part of that big world. We have amazing truth to live out and to offer to that big world too, not just Lowell, not just what we're able to do. And I think the future is going to be not only in new kinds of ministries, where the old ones just aren't going to work anymore. New kinds of ministers. The old ones keep retiring. Did you notice that? I mean, and this one's going to pretty soon, really. You know, if that's what's going to happen, that's good, because you need some new kinds, and I don't know what those are. Do you? Do you know, Roger? There's a few of them around, but man, I'm not one of them. They got visions like I don't have. They're young. I'm old. So that's part of what the future is too. Open and affirming will go beyond just our LGBT brothers and sisters. But it'll enable us to know how to live through what we're given that we've never imagined before. And it'll remind us what a great truth Christian faith is, and just how well giving of oneself so another might live can work. It's a really exciting time. It's an in-between time right now. But we've already committed ourselves to new beginnings. And by God, our Creator God has not been sitting there doing nothing. Creation has gone on, and it's going to keep going on relentlessly. And isn't it exciting to think that we'll be a part of it? It says benediction, and I'm going to offer one in just a minute, but we hope everyone will then be seated for the final acts of this celebration and this worship service. Wonderful song, and then also a montage up there that'll show some things about maybe where we're going, but certainly who we are. Amy, where are you? Thanks for being here. And look who's behind you. Your predecessor, yes. Those are two ladies that nobody ever sees. But boy, they helped keep this place going for a long time. They're called, what do you call yourselves? Church secretaries. Anyway. Now, a benediction is supposed to be a good word, a saying of goodness. I'm just going to encourage you to go out and be a part of that which is good every chance you get. And especially when the situations are such that the good is not readily apparent. Don't forget, you always know what will get you toward the good, and that is giving yourself to another. It's the way of Christ. It's the only way that forever shall be true and shall never die. Go out and do that on purpose every chance you get, and guess what? All of us doing that will already be a part of that which we call eternity, a life which never dies. God bless us all to that end. Amen.
These things can never